Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me. My name is Saab Johal, and it's great that you're interested in this video. I'm a recidivist psychologist who keeps coming back for more. I've worked as a psychologist for, wow, 30 years now, and as a clinician for about 16 of those years. And you can find out more about me if you click my LinkedIn profile. And the project that I'm thinking about today on LinkedIn is all about self-leadership. And in a nutshell, this is all about having a developed sense of who you are, what you can do, and where you're going, coupled with having a developed sense of your ability to influence your communication, emotions, and behavior on your way to getting to wherever it is that you want to be. So self-leadership is the process by which you influence yourself to achieve your objectives. And today, welcome, is our first in a series of collaborations on self-leadership between myself and my co-collaborator, who is Julie Treanor. I'd like to introduce her, or allow her to introduce herself right now. Hi, Julie.
Well, hi there, Sam. It's great to be working with you on this. Yeah, I am a leadership developer. And what that means is I'm a coach, a mentor, and I guess a bit of a consultant and a facilitator in this field. And I've been working doing this specifically for 12 years, but a career of about 20 years in leadership and management positions. So I'm fascinated about the whole field of leadership, but particularly personal leadership, in a sense that often we associate leadership with a role or a position in an organization, but actually I see it much more as for everybody. So it's going to be fascinating to see what comes out in our conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited about the project with you because I know the wealth of experience that you bring to this collaboration, the experience that you have in working in lots of different contexts too. So I'm hoping that it's going to come out as we start this first in our series. So just a little bit more about self-leadership, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about this as we go along, Julie. It's like, I think of self-leadership as inside-out leadership. So we're constantly developing self-awareness, self-confidence, and self-efficacy or self-belief. And so self-awareness is about knowing your intentions and your values, as well as knowing what can push your buttons and what could derail you as well. So your good stuff and the stuff that kind of gets you going in a not so great way. And self-confidence then comes from your knowledge of your strengths and your abilities. And as we take actions and we develop our skills throughout our careers, then we start to become more confident. And that's closely linked to competence, I think, as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And self-efficacy is the belief that whatever comes our way, we can handle it. We can take the feedback, which we might get, sometimes not so good. We can accept it, we can adjust, and we can advance forwards. We keep moving forwards. And with self-efficacy, we can be more creative and innovative if we're able to believe in ourselves. So in order for that to happen, we kind of need our basic needs met, food, shelter, being able to kind of like pay the bills. But then we start to look for meaning in our lives. And the first step of self-leadership is to be able to stop and just step back from the things that trigger us to just react to what's going on. And then figure out, are we being controlled by that trigger? Or actually, do we need to consider our intention? And the intention is what's important to us, our values, and what we're trying to achieve. And so then by paying attention to our intentions, we can then start to live a life of choice and have a work life of choice as well. So intention comes before any kind of action or behavior rather than a reaction. And so to bring us back full circle then, influence is then the result of purposeful action. We have to positively influence ourselves and the world around us if we're going to make any kind of change that we care passionately about. There's a lot there, Julie. What kind of like stood out for you?
Well, I think you're right. I think for me, the way I relate to all of this is that, we've got a choice about how we live in the world. We can kind of go with the flow, and that is take what the world fires at us, if you like. And that could be day to day, but also it could be in terms of what we want to do with our life. Leadership is about making stuff happen, as far as I'm concerned. So if you want to live a more engaged, more satisfied, happier life, then you kind of got to work at that, and that means you've got to lead yourself in the process. But I think sometimes we stop and think about these things, and it can get really, really complicated. There are our values, there's our purpose, there's our, all those other needs that we want. We're also trying to satisfy other people in our lives and at work. So for me, simply, self-leadership comes back to knowing yourself really well in order that you can achieve what you want. And however that means. So all those triggers that you've talked about is knowing them so that when they happen, that you can deal with them in the best way you can. But equally, you can set yourself up in situations mean you don't push those triggers, either knowingly or unknowingly. So you take away the situation that kind of puts yourself in high stress, or that might make you really anxious, that means that that's going to be harder on you. So again, it's about making it easy on you. So when you're leading yourself in a way that works better for you, it's actually easier for you, and it gets you to where you want to go a bit faster. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. So through that knowledge, we're able to actually achieve our objectives perhaps quicker or more effectively than we would do otherwise. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking there was self-care. And where does that fit into this? And I guess I was thinking about self-care as almost like a tool of self-leadership. It's something that you can do in the here and now, and also think about what it is that you need to plan for yourself around your personal care in order for you to be able to lead yourself effectively. Have you got any thoughts about that, Julie?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the self-care, the way I kind of relate to it is that try to develop, be kind to yourself, quite frankly, is look after yourself well in a way that means you can do what you want, and also be there for the other people in your life that you need to be there for. I think often, and maybe, people suggest this might be more common for women, I don't know, maybe you have a view on this, is that often women give so much to themselves to other people, but they don't look after themselves. So that self-care is really important. But actually, I see it a lot professionally when I work with people, in men as well, is that they give so much to their work and their family and all other things that actually they don't necessarily look after themselves as well as they could. And that could be physically as well as mentally and intellectually and emotionally. And I think actually I've seen over years this get harder and harder for people because there's so much to do in life. We want so much. There is so much opportunity now that to do all of it is kind of exhausting at a human level. So it's working out what works for you, looking after yourself, but also it's that fine art. I always say to people, it's a really fine balance between being selfless and helping and being there for other people, and being selfish to be able to be kind to yourself. So yeah, it's one of those balancing acts, I think. But fundamentally, yeah, look after yourself. It's a bit like when you're on an aeroplane and they always say, the oxygen mask comes down and you have to put your own mask on first before you put anybody else's on. For me, that's what self-care is about.
Yeah.
Is looking after yourself in order that you can do what you want.
Yeah, and that's where my thoughts are going as well. I like how you put that. It's sort of like the difference and the tension between selflessness and selfishness. And I guess that fundamentally what we're talking about here is something that's relational. And I think that actually what you talked about there, and perhaps there being a gender difference and a gender split, I think you might be onto something there. I think that what we're revealing here is that actually perhaps women are better at thinking about the relational aspects in terms of looking after other people and perhaps neglect the self-care. But I think that perhaps men can be guilty or fall into that trap too, but in a different way, in that they perhaps feel a different driver towards that and perhaps feel less limited in terms of self-care, but there's more an issue around self-sacrifice. So it's not necessarily a selfishness, but there's a self-sacrifice. And I don't think it's just men that do that either. I think there are many women who do that too. But I think there's another dimension there that perhaps to think about.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the only other thing that kind of pops up for me when I think about self-care and self-leadership, it's as much about just developing good habits. And, effectively, it's self-leadership is about developing good practice and good habits. And that applies to self-care as well. Because when we don't look after ourselves, those triggers that you talked about earlier on can come in. We can get a bit tired, we can get a bit anxious, we can get a bit cranky.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to be leading ourselves really well, it's making sure that we're in a good emotional state, as it were, to deal with whatever the world throws at us.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the things that's really interesting that we know now is that actually our brains are essentially problem-solving machines. And if we come across a situation where we're feeling a little bit fragile, feeling a little bit negative already, our brains will seek to protect us from that and not go into that negative spiral. But at the same time, they're looking for threat, which says, beware, beware, this is going to make you feel rubbish. And then we end up avoiding that situation and feeling quite negative about that avoidance. So we can end up in the trap that unless we are aware and have that awareness of what our brains can do to us sometimes, that we end up reacting to what our brain is telling us to do rather than being able to take a step back and going, yeah, maybe perhaps my brain is telling me that this feels dangerous, but perhaps there's another way of doing this.
Yeah, and it works the other way as well, in that sometimes we don't know what's happening, what's
Mm.
going to happen, where you're going, and in the absence of information and knowledge, the brain protects ourselves by trying to fill that information
Mm.
gap. And so what we do then is start to make things up.
Mm.
We tell ourselves little stories, which can go from, I'm not sure how this is going to work out, to, kind of death and doom stories. And we can see the worst in situations when in fact it's this kind of alternative reality. And to me, that's the way that our brain just fills that gap, because it's trying to protect us from something. That a mild anxiety can turn into some sort of catastrophic event in our own minds, rather than actually going, well, I'll just wait and see.
Yeah, yeah,
See what happens. I'm sure it'll work out.
yeah. And it's hard to occupy that space, right? To be able to just say, I'll see.
Totally, totally. Yeah. And I think some people are more comfortable with doing that than others. Often people talk about taking greater risks, but I actually think it's more about people being comfortable with being uncomfortable, not knowing, and just saying to yourself and believing, actually, we'll figure it out, or it will be okay. But yeah, on a bad day when we're anxious about something, it can go from something to nothing very, very quickly.
Yeah. I think we're starting to talk about some of the stuff that I think we're going to be talking about in this article too. So let's get into our first discussion, I think. And I came across an interesting article in the New York Times called A Misfits Guide to Navigating the Office, which put 5 ideas up that the author, Jennifer Romolini, found useful when she found that the success that she had achieved in her career had not transformed her in the way that she expected. In fact, she said that she found herself the same misfit, as she described herself, as she always was. And so she set out on a mission to help people like her, and particularly I think she was focusing on women, to stop trying to fit in as a square peg in a corporate round hole, so to speak, and to recognize that they can make it precisely as they were. So I thought, and I shared this with Julie, and we thought we might just reflect upon some of the advice that she offered. And the first point that she offered was to embrace your weird, which I thought was great. So, Julie, what did you think about that as her first principle?
We did. I guess the thing that I was struck by is wondering, well, what is this weirdness? And I think the way that she described it in the article, as I was reading it, was thinking, well, maybe that's not quite so weird, because I'm a bit like that, and I know a lot of people that are a bit like that. But I think the important thing that for me that came out in the article was that on the outside, we might give out this impression of, being poised or confident or professional, which is, really important in the corporate setting. But I think it applies to any setting personally, and, in smaller, less corporate organizations. But inside, there can be a heck of a lot going on, which
Mm.
makes us feel weird, because we think that we're not like the people we're surrounded by. But actually, I think in reality, in my experience, is that we've all got this inner world going on that feels and looks weird and different from what's going on the outside and what you're experiencing, by watching other people's behaviors. But I think we all have these internal kind of anxieties. We can be nervous, we can be clumsy, we can be not sure how to reply, or thinking about what other people might want us to be like or
Mm.
want us to say. So it did make me laugh that she described this as kind of a misfit and weirdness, but actually I think it's closer to normality than we might otherwise think.
Yeah, I agree with you. But often we don't really get to pierce the kind of the gloss that we come across in kind of, things that we watch on, corporate leadership, or the behavior that we see sometimes in the workplace. There's everybody, you get this feeling, or we don't necessarily know, but we're like, well, they're not like what I feel like inside. So when we feel off sync with that, it can feel quite uncomfortable. We can end up perceiving ourselves as a bit weird. But I think one of the things that we're now starting to uncover here is that diversity of thoughts, of personhood, is recognized as a strength. I'll tell you a little story here, I think, which might help to unlock this. Certainly did for me. So I recently confessed to my 8-year-old daughter that for most of my life, I had thoughts that pop up in my head like cartoons. I literally think of situations, or something will come up, and it'll come up as an animated thing in my head. And for years, I thought that was weird. But I find it's something that gives me a unique perspective, and I also find it quite funny. And then it actually engages a completely different brain set for me, which allows me to be more playful. So it's something that, instead of trying to suppress and thinking, well, that's a bit odd, I've actually welcomed that into me. And I've also found that other people do that too. Occasionally I find that other people do that too. And the added bonus is that it gave my daughter the permission to then describe to me how she sometimes thinks as a comic strip. So she almost thinks of things like balloons and things that come out of people's heads, and then they move on to the next scene. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to surface this, I think.
It is indeed, and actually slightly kind of different perspective on it. But I always remember I was away at let's just call it a retreat. It's not something I'd done before, and I'd gone out of really to go with a friend. It was a girls' weekend away, and it was one of those situations where you do those introductions around, and everybody's saying who they are and what they're looking forward to, and all those kind of general things. Is that I was hearing from everybody else that they were so excited about what was coming up. They were really stoked for it and really inspired. And as it got further and further around, actually all I could help thinking was, I'm actually terrified. I have no idea why I'm here. I feel so uncomfortable about it. And I am pretty well known for saying what I think, which on this occasion just was that I just said, well, actually, I'm pretty terrified. And the whole room just kind of relaxed in a way that they're like, oh, me too. It is exciting. But I think the point is that when we can admit that we see the world in a different way, so whether it's the way I saw it or the way you see it or the way your daughter, which I think is so lovely to think that she thinks in cartoons, is that then when people know that, they can kind of see as well that they've got their own way, and that's okay too, and that we're not as weird as people make us out to be. It just feels like we're a misfit in there.
Yeah, I think that brings us nicely into the second point that in the article, and I'll leave a link to the article in the description and the post and in the comments as well, so that you can read it too and follow along. And that was not to fake it. Don't fake it. So what do you think about that, Julie?
Well, I guess if I've got any Achilles heel in my career and feedback from people is that, on one hand, I have people say to me, you're so honest, Julie, you're so direct, you always say what you think. And I'm always surprised because I don't know how to do it any other way. I find it's hard to be something other than myself. Yeah. So this fake it till you make it syndrome, it's not something I've really practiced very much, which sometimes has got me into trouble because I've said and done things that perhaps professionally have not been as fortuitous, or people have kind of looked at me a bit strangely. But I do know the people that I work with that actually, particularly when it comes to going for new jobs, or going to meetings that they might be nervous about, where they've got to make a presentation or a pitch or whatever it might be, is they embrace this notion of fake it. Because if they can fake it, then eventually they'll make it. And I'm always fascinated that this has become such an embedded mantra that, we should fake it and then we'll make it. When in fact, actually, I see it the other way, is that it's much better if you just be yourself and concentrate on that. Because when you've got a lot going on, if you're having to try and think about being something other than yourself. That just adds another layer of stress onto what is probably a bit of a nerve-wracking situation. I don't know about you. Have you faked it till you've made it?
I've caught myself thinking that at times, absolutely. But I think what I've learned in my life as I've kind of like progressed on in my career is that faking it until you make it can lead you to places where you end up spending a lot of time doing things you don't really care about, and then setting up the conditions for experiencing imposter syndrome, because you've actually found yourself in a position that you feel like people are going to find out any minute now that you shouldn't be there. Well, actually, you've kind of faked yourself into this position, relying upon you being able to kind of catch up. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's, I found myself wondering what the it was in fake it until you make it. And I thought, well, what's wrong with the it that you have right now, such that you feel like you want to fake it to get somewhere else? And I think that there's nothing wrong with developing skills and setting yourself a challenging timeline in order to get there, but figuring out what's triggering the need to fake it in the first place, I think that becomes the key. What's so appealing about faking it?
It is, isn't it? It's kind of, yeah, what are we trying to satisfy in ourselves? It's perhaps maybe saying, well, I'm not good enough. That whole imposter syndrome does start to come out. But yeah, it's a case then of how long can you fake it for? I don't know. Yeah, I because as you can tell, I don't suffer with this terribly much. But I guess if I do think back, there are one or two occasions where I have gone in and thought I need to be in a certain way with a certain group of people or in a certain circumstance. That when I've come away from that and reflected on, well, how well did it go? I probably, I can think of one or two occasions where it just didn't feel very good because of, I think, what you call as imposter syndrome, because trying to be somebody else is, bringing that imposter on yourself, is that you then start to judge yourself by some other standard other than yourself, rather than thinking about judging yourself on how you did is your real self as opposed to your fake self.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does, doesn't it? And it's so counter to the kind of like the authentic leadership movement, isn't it? Is that you actually bring your whole self, your entire self, and just, not any added frills. Well, that's not quite right, but you're not kind of being someone who you're not. And I guess the fake it until you make it thing is kind of like, you fake it and then somehow you'll close the gap. And then this will become your authentic self. But actually, people find themselves in is that they fake it and they get what it is that they think that they want, and they go, well, actually, I don't really feel like I can close this gap because I know myself that I actually said something that wasn't true, or I wasn't capable or competent at doing in order to get to this role. So you're constantly feeling and experiencing this gap, which makes you feel really uncomfortable. So I don't know. I think she's right. I think fake it until you make it may work for some people. I think you're setting yourself up for a little bit of that dissonance of knowing that you kind of don't really know this.
It does, but it just adds a layer of complexity on to what you're doing. And if leadership's anything, it is trying to be who you really are, and doing what you really want, as opposed to following other people's point of view, and trying to live up to some standards that you're not really comfortable with. So yeah, I'm all for not faking it. I think it's a fool's game in the long run. But that said, for some people, I think having a clear picture of a idealized or future self or some sort of alter ego, if you like, can be a positive thing, as long as you see it for what it is, that it is a device to help you achieve something. And I know, sports people and, people in performance arts, they do all of this. They frame it up. So they're kind of faking it in order that they can get themselves to a state to be the best version of themselves. But I think for most of us, no, it's probably just be yourself.
Yeah.
Best you can.
Agreed, I think. Let's move on to number 3, which is equally interesting. I think what they're saying here is that the headline is confidence is overrated. What do you think about that, Julie?
Well, of all the things that when I talk to people about what are they looking for from working with a coach, they say to me, I want to be more confident. And it's really interesting when you start to peel back, well, what does that really mean? Is that it's kind of like this, and I think in the article it talks about this fleeting state,
Yeah.
but it is this idealized state of all powerful, all strong, all confident on an ongoing basis. Um, but actually, it is much more fleeting. And I get people to start to think less about being confident, but actually being more courageous
Mm.
and using that as something to work on rather than trying to find this nirvana, this
Mm.
moment of confidence that somehow is going to sustain you because it is so fleeting
Mm.
and it can come and go. It can get knocked back quite easily. And I think for people who maybe have had their confidence knocked a bit, through whatever means, is that they feel like they don't have anything left. It's a bit like cats with 9 lives. You only have so many lives of confidence left in you. I mean, I'm curious from a psychological point of view, how do you relate to all of this?
Mm. I think you're right. I think thinking about this in terms of courageousness, which you can then summon up from I think a different well than confidence, which I think, as you're right, it ebbs and flows, right? It's fleeting. Sometimes you feel like you have it, and other times you don't. You're still the same person. But I think courageousness comes from values. It comes from things like integrity, where you feel like you see a gap between what you feel like should be happening from your values and what is actually happening out there in the world. That might be your behavior. It might be what's going on in your organization. It might be a gap between where you are now and where it is that you want to be. Being realistic and being able to look at that in an open-eyed way, I think that's where courage comes in. Confidence is fleeting. I think it feels surface. So as well as courageousness, I guess I was thinking about competence. Competence is something that lasts, and being radically honest about what you still think you need to learn, I think was excellent advice in this article, because it's only through self-reflection then can we have a solid basis to be confident, because it really is underpinned by your competence, because it relates back to the fake it until you make it. You can't really be confident about something if you're faking it, right? Because there's nothing underpinning what it is that you're going to be faking about.
Exactly. And I think the thing with competence is that, there are some things we're going to be really good at. There'll be other things we're less good at. And there'll be some things we've only done once or never before. And so it's always the same that when we start something for the first time, we're not going to be as good at it. And therefore, our levels of competence are going to be low. And therefore, we can be confident that our levels of competence are low. And therefore, you just have to be courageous to get over it.
Mm.
Because, and that comes in, I think, is accepting that we've got things to learn. And again, it's one of the techniques that I use, and I use with my coaching clients, is to instead of focus on being confident, is actually just focusing on doing your best and accepting that as long as that's what you're doing in the moment, then that'll be good enough, because the next time you do it, you'll probably do it better, because first time is always hardest, as it were. But I think that it is also from a leadership point of view, and if you think about leaders in management positions, that often, people expect them to be so confident and capable at everything, when in fact, actually, they can't be, because they're just human. And I think managers that can stand up and say, I just don't know. I have no idea how we're going to do that, or accept that it's not their skill level. That is something that some people struggle to do, but actually I think is the biggest sign of leadership, when people, whether individual or in a position of leadership, to say, I don't know.
Mm.
And self-leadership is that whole kind of process of learning and growing as you go, being curious and listening and trying things out. And the more things you try out, you come back to feeling more comfortable with being uncomfortable, as opposed to this endless search for confidence.
I think you're onto something there. And I guess as you were talking, I was thinking about what's the terrifying thing about saying that you don't know as a leader. And I think one of the things about that is that people think that it's going to be permanent. Is that you don't know now and you're never going to know. And now you're a person who doesn't know. Whereas actually, and that's how you're going to be pigeonholed. You're the don't know. And I think that there's danger there that people see. But I think that we almost have to kind of like reframe the acceptability, as you say, with uncertainty, is that it's a transitory phase. And it then affords you an opportunity to make a plan about how it is that you will then start to know, and seeing it as a process rather than as a certain finite outcome, is that you are now a don't know.
Yeah. As opposed to a person that can figure it out if you just give yourself the space and time to do so.
Absolutely, right? Because if you don't admit that you don't know, how do you progress, right? If you are all seeing and all knowing, then what's the point of everyone else, right? You may as well just do it yourself.
Oh, that's a topic we could get into.
Yeah, because it happens, right? Yeah. So, okay, let's move on to the fourth one then. Now, the fourth one was interesting. Stop overthinking. What do you think about that? I'm interested here as, maybe there's some perspectives here from a gender point of view as well.
Yeah, it is. But I think it comes back a little bit to what I said before. We do have a tendency to overthink things when we don't know, where we've got a gap in our knowledge. I'm not sure how we're going to solve this problem, or we're not sure what's going to happen, or we overthink things by reflecting too hard. I mean, I'm all for reflecting because it's a key component of kind of self-care and self-leadership, but I think we can go from one extreme to the other, and that's where overthinking can be not helpful. I think so. It's anchoring ourselves back. I think the article mentioned about anchoring yourself in reality rather than overthinking things all of the time. So not sure. What do you think?
I think you're right around anchoring. I think it's important that we have and we figure out where our anchors are. Now, it might be that that's our previous experience, or we can think about it objectively and say, I sent in this job application. It's been 3 days. That means that they hate me. It means I'm never going to get a job. It means I'm doomed in this job forever. I'm going to die in this job. Okay, so that's the way that our spiral of thinking can take us. So I think it relates to, can we take a step back and reflect and say, do you know what? And maybe that they're absolutely overwhelmed. This is a really, really popular job and they're taking their time to kind of like process and sift through. And I'm just going to have to sit with that discomfort and uncertainty for a while. It's very, very difficult to do when you're in that situation, right? And I think that then, when you find yourself spiraling into this unchecked negative loop, I think that then that also brings us nicely into point number 5. Where we're thinking about anchoring. How do we check out? Who do we check out our thoughts with? Who is it safe to do that with, right? And I think that the fifth one where it says Misfits Unite, it's like finding your tribe. I think for me was the thing that came out from there. Who do you, as a leader, who are you able to talk this stuff through with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the relationship between finding your tribe and overthinking is really, really important, because I think if we try to solve this stuff on our own, we can get too much in our heads and overthink things. Whereas actually talking to somebody who we trust, who we can think will help us think things through, you're going to cut through all the catastrophes and stress that goes with it. But actually, you will start to find other people that are the same as you. And we all want to feel like we've got a sense of belonging. And I think that sometimes we try too hard, which, now I'm thinking back as we're talking, fake it till I make it. You can kind of want to go to networking events because you want to connect with the kind of people who you think you want to connect with. But actually, when you get there, you just want the holes to open up in the floor and disappear because you find that they are not your people. And when you do find people who think like you, are supportive towards you, are care about you, quite frankly, in a human sense, even if it's a more personal sense, then all this leadership stuff can be so much easier because you've got somebody who is there for you and believes in you and can help you to start to do that for yourself.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, when we get trapped in our own minds, that's when the overthinking takes over. So when you can find people who care about you, who think like you, and there are, that's a process. And as you say, you can turn up at some events and you're like, oh, I thought you were going to be like me, but actually I feel like I want to disappear right now because you all feel like you've got this sussed. And I feel like the learner in this situation. I can see that you can see my training wheels. It's that obvious. I can feel like that. And so when you are able to strip away and get yourself into a situation where you can strip away all the kind of, the trappings of leadership, all the role labels and all of that stuff. So finding that safe space to be able to share the real stuff that's going on for you, finding points of commonality, but also points of learning where people say, yeah, I felt like that and I did this and I moved myself into a different place. I'm not sure whether that's going to work for you or not, but perhaps this is something that we can try on and see how this strategy might work in your life. And that's the fit, right? It's what works in theory, but what's going to work for you in your life right now. And that's the magic, trying to make that happen.
It is, and I think there maybe again there's a gender difference here. I'd be curious from your point of view, but I actually think women generally are pretty good about finding their tribe, finding the kind of people who that they can get to know and have a relationship with, friendship with, if you like. Women tend to be much more open, and I've run a lot of women's kind of networking events, if you like, or community building events. I like to think about them really because the kind of people that I'm always trying to seek out are people that are looking for something other than a cursory transactional conversation. But generally, I find that women are very open to talking about what they're thinking and what they're feeling and their experiences, and they will find commonality. I always wonder, I only ever hear men kind of talking about the sport or, it's something that's a little more neutral. I don't know. There clearly are people out there, particularly people who are focusing on their own development, but it's not something that I've noticed in my experience that men do quite as easily. They'll go and find out their tribes in different ways.
I think you may be onto something. I can only speak really from my experience, but I work as a clinical psychologist for quite a lot of my career, and that's quite a female-dominated profession. Particularly in the kind of clinical psychology that I do, which is more kind of family or child-oriented clinical psychology, to the point where it was kind of, I had people telling me that I was weird for wanting to work with children. That's how strange it became as a man. So yeah, I think it can be strange, particularly depending upon what field that you're working in. But I've been lucky. I've sought out experiences where I have been able to have those deeper connections and those deeper conversations about what's going on for me as in my job or in my leadership roles. I did the Leadership New Zealand program in 2013, which for me was pivotal in terms of being able to think about big things that were going on for New Zealand with a cohort of people who were up for that conversation, but also brought the whole of themselves. It wasn't just about the thing that we were thinking about, which might have been a topic of the day, but it was actually, what's my history? Where has my leadership, where's my personal journey brought me to so far? And how can I connect with others in order to solve this problem? So I think, there are different facets of ourselves. Part of that is gender. Part of that is the professional training that we've had. Part of that is the situation that we find ourselves in the here and now. And all of that comes together such that our needs might change. So the tribe that worked for me right now in this part of my career, I might have to kind of not necessarily leave them behind, but also recognize that perhaps I need something else in addition to that. So I think the self-reflection and constantly not constantly, because as you say, overthinking is not good, but being able to check in on ourselves and say, is what I needed a year ago what I need now in terms of where it is that I want to be, in order to produce the impact that and be the change that I want to see in my organization or the world. I think that becomes really, really important. That's where your tribe and your connection with others becomes important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's as I was listening to you, the words that kind of stuck out and resonated is that, and I think this is, a little bit about my philosophy on leadership, is finding people who are up for it, whatever it is, and whatever the up is. Because if leadership is anything, it is being up for something, wanting to make a difference, wanting to make stuff happen, wanting to improve yourself, but finding it in, I find if you try to do it on your own, it can be a pretty lonely journey. And I can't remember the exact quote, but something about, you can go further on your own, but you'll go faster on your own, but you'll go further in the company of other people. And so I think the advice about misfits unite, whatever kind of misfit you are, there are people out there that will be not necessarily like you, but be up for whatever it is that you're up for too. Whatever really bothers you, whatever the things that you want to change in the world. It's just finding them. And sometimes that's harder than others, but sometimes it's a lot easier than you might think if you go looking for them.
Thanks, Julie. It's been brilliant talking with you today. Thanks very much. If you're watching and you've made it this far, thanks for staying with us. Please let us know in the comments or contact us what you thought, what resonated with you. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? And do you have any tips perhaps for those of us who find themselves wondering why they aren't transformed into different people by the success that they've achieved or otherwise? We hope to be back here again soon. So until then, thanks so much, Julie. Any finishing thoughts, final thoughts from you?
No, I think it's a fascinating. It was a fascinating article, and I think anybody that's watching this is well worth just going to read it for yourself. Certainly for me, and talking it through, is that that ultimately, we're all misfits in the world, and embrace it for what it is.
Thanks so much, Julie. I'll leave Julie's link in here as well. You'll see this, and we'll be collaborating on more conversations like this very soon. Cheers, Julie. Thanks very much, everyone.
Take care.
Bye now.